Thanks, Jem, and thanks everyone for being here. I keep wanting to wish you all good morning, and then I realize I should be wishing you all good evening. And also thanks, Tim, for laying out the treaty, giving some context, and Vanessa for laying out the humanitarian impacts. That's a great introduction to what I'll talk about, which are three of the provisions often collectively known as the positive obligations: victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. Which are particularly relevant for the Pacific region, although also relevant for other parts of the world. I'll briefly explain the obligations themselves and discuss, if we have time, the steps that states parties can take to begin implementing them, and briefly highlight some of the benefits of the obligations that may be useful to emphasize in your advocacy. So first, Article 6.1 obligates states parties to assist individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, including that which has already occurred. It's a holistic approach that requires a range of types of assistance. The treaty specifically mentions, it's a non-exhaustive list, but it specifically mentions medical care, rehabilitation, psychological support, as well as measures to promote socioeconomic inclusion. It must be sensitive to differences in age and gender, and must be prohibited without discrimination to the affected individuals. And its end goal is to ensure that affected individuals can realize their human rights. 6.2 focuses on addressing the environmental damage caused by nuclear weapons, which Vanessa also mentioned. It obliges states to, quote, take necessary and appropriate measures towards the remediation of areas contaminated by nuclear weapons, and again addresses nuclear weapons use and testing. Because it requires measures towards environmental remediation, it recognizes that in most cases, the environment cannot be returned to the pre-detonation state, but mandates that steps be taken to concrete steps be taken to clean affected areas and further reduce exposure to contaminants. So although it doesn't define remediation, we argue it should be understood broadly. So if there's contamination, it can be contained or treated or removed. But there also should be measures to reduce exposure, such as ensuring that contaminated areas are marked and fenced, disseminating warnings in appropriate languages and media that's suitable to the area, and providing risk reduction education for affected communities. And then Article 6, while it's critical to the TPNW, must be read in conjunction with Article 7 on international cooperation and assistance. In my experience, that's an article that sometimes countries forget to mention. Because together, these two provisions create a framework of shared responsibility for addressing the human and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. Article 6 places the responsibility on affected states parties to play the lead role in victim assistance and environmental remediation, and that's for practical and legal reasons. Practically, even though it seems counterintuitive, they are best positioned to understand the needs of their people and to distribute assistance. Similarly, they have best access to affected areas, which facilitates assessments of contamination and actions to remediate the environment. It also protects the sovereignty of states and gives them agency for addressing matters that affect them. And finally, it's on legal front, it echoes the precedent of past disarmament treaties and human rights law. At the same time, Article 7 requires all states parties to cooperate on facilitating implementation of the treaty, and obliges states parties, quote, in a position to do so, to provide assistance to those affected states parties. Assistance can come in a range of forms: technical assistance, material assistance, financial assistance. But because it's a range of assistance, not just financial, we argue that all states parties can help in some way. It's important to note that the TPNWs does not absolve user states and testing states of responsibility. There's a specific Article 7.6 that ensures that using and testing states have a legal as well as moral responsibility to address the harm they caused. And it also does not preclude affected states or individuals from seeking redress or compensation through other avenues, and that existing compensation arrangements, for example, the Marshall Islands has some arrangements with the United States. They may not be adequate, but it does have arrangements through the US, with the US. Those arrangements are unaltered by the TPNW's provisions. So those arrangements remain intact. The TPN, those are the provisions on paper. As Tim mentioned, the TPNW's first meeting of states parties is scheduled for January. And that's an important opportunity to push states parties to start implementing their positive obligations. So that's true for ICANN advocates. Many of you are from states that already are parties to the treaty, but even if your states aren't party, you can start pushing these norms. And I'll note a few of the specific steps you can urge countries to commit to at the first meeting of states parties. And if you're interested in more detail, our clinic at Harvard is publishing fact sheets on these positive obligations in just a couple of weeks, hopefully by the end of the week, but in a couple of weeks. And if it's okay, I'll send them to Jem. Maybe you can send them out to this group when they're ready. So first, states parties should conduct an assessment of victims' needs and the environmental contamination, and also on the national capacity to address them. Gathering such data allows states to assess the problem, prioritize actions, and monitor progress in dealing with the harm. Sharing information of the presence of and threats of contamination can also help local communities protect themselves. Second, we argue that affected states parties should create an infrastructure for victim assistance and environmental remediation, which includes these sort of practical steps like a national plan with a timeline, a budget with money earmarked for victim assistance and remediation, new laws and policies, a government focal point to ensure efforts are coordinated. And this national strategy promotes accountability and ensures that the efforts are timely and coordinated and comprehensive. Third, states parties should commit to certain principles that inform implementation. Perhaps the most important is states parties should meaningfully consult and actively involve affected individuals and communities at all stages of the process. As you well know, these groups are independent agents who know their own needs and have valuable insights for how to address them. Inclusivity should both be at the national level, but also at the international level, at these international meetings, both the first meeting of states parties and going forward. Other important principles include non-discrimination, transparency, and accessibility, particularly on the victim assistance side. And then just to conclude, so I make sure to leave enough time for questions and so forth, I just want to, I've focused on sort of legal side and the provisions and the implementation. I want to note a few points that may seem obvious to you, but are worth remembering, particularly as you're encouraging new countries to ratify the treaty. First, and also particularly states that may be somewhat cynical about the treaty, but first is that assisting victims and remediating the environment do not depend on nuclear armed states joining the treaty. These are obligations states parties can and should start to implement immediately. That's a way the treaty can have an immediate effect. Second, they open chances to, or ways that open doors to help affected states to new sources of support that address the impacts of nuclear weapons use and testing on their territory. Third, the obligations are feasible. The treaty spreads responsibility across states and recognizes that some measures may need to be achieved over time. Fourth, they can make a tangible difference in the lives of affected individuals and communities. And finally, the positive obligations help ensure that the TPNW meets its humanitarian goals by providing a comprehensive response to nuclear weapons, one that both prevents future use and testing and remediates the consequences of these weapons. So happy to answer questions. That's positive obligations in a nutshell. But again, happy to answer questions, and thanks for having me.
That's excellent, Bonnie. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, really setting out those positive obligations really clearly. And if any, it was also a lot of content that we've already heard tonight, and have heard from all three speakers. So if anyone's not clear about something, if you missed it, if you missed something, that's okay. Just ask a question for a clarification. So I'll make a call now for questions for Bonnie. And if the questions are slow, there was a question in the chat for you, Vanessa. Not sure if you've seen it, but there's a question which is from Effie. Has there been any attempts slash successes for reparations from US / Britain / France to Pacific Island nations?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I thought even others in the group could actually answer that, and Bonnie might be able to answer as well what she knows, because there would have been so much work that went into those two articles, so you would know what exists or not. My impression, very briefly, and ever being in French Polynesia and just seeing even requests for medical help, is just an appalling status. I, again, from the work of others, I think, and Dimity, you might want to answer on that. The only records that I see are ever to servicemen of the countries. You know, you might actually have something in place, but some of the documentaries show that even some of them say, look, you know, they're almost in the same position as the, you know, colonized test victims in terms of any help. But that's the only thing I can kind of recollect of, yes, veterans or servicemen might get some response. I didn't like this story in French Polynesia, and I was going, goodness me, how many years later? And to find there's 600 files asking for compensation, and you have an absurd statistic of what health case is even accepted. So I felt the situation is extremely dire just from that brief insight into what people go through. Yeah. Or if there is help, it's often done secretly. I mean, in the past, the help that you could get. So how it is now, I actually don't know. And you might know the Fiji case, Dimity, yeah, to give some details. Thank you.
Vanaka, Vanessa. Yeah, look, there have been all sorts of cases being put forward for a long time, particularly around veterans, as people will know, here in Australia, but in Fiji as well. There were 300 Fijian personnel used in the British nuclear testing in the 1950s. And as yet, not a single one of the court cases that they've taken against Britain have been successful. There's a mere handful of the veterans still alive now. But luckily, due to the activism in Fiji, which is very, very strong, and Vanessa is a wonderful example of that, but we have others here on our call tonight who are Fijian activists, so my hat's off to all of you. Through that activism, we know also that we've got the testimonies of so many of those nuclear veterans, and those cases will continue to be pushed forward into Britain and so forth by their families and by the Fiji government as well. And we see that reflected in the way that the Fiji government has spoken up about their own Fiji's experience of nuclear testing because of their veterans and so forth. But again, as Vanessa says, too often we're hearing it in relation to veterans, but we don't necessarily hear it in relations to the community. And here in Australia, we've seen that, you know, time and time again, you know, that we haven't had any satisfaction really for the veterans here, other than getting a gold card a few years ago. But we also haven't seen enough satisfaction for the people who've been most directly affected, which is the Aboriginal communities on the ground in South Australia and Western Australia. So there's much to be done yet on that.
Thanks for that, Vanessa and Dimity. And there are a couple of questions for you now, Bonnie. The first one is, do you have any examples of a case for assistance and remediation?
Yeah, so I've done some looking into that. I would say there's a lot of models for efforts at this. And we try to survey both on the remediation front and on the assistance front, you know, like, but there's no sort of perfect model for victim assistance or perfect model for environmental remediation. We did to the best of our ability, and there's obviously language barriers on certain countries. But looking at several countries, I mean, the Marshall Islands has done some on victim assistance. The US has done some on victim assistance, some on environmental remediation. Those are just a few examples. Kazakhstan's done some on on this front. There's no perfect model. There's a lot of flaws in all of these models. Alicia Sanders Zaka and one of her colleagues has done a survey that's published on some of the victim assistance models you might look at. We haven't published our survey yet, particularly on the environment side. And so what we're trying to do is take bits and pieces from each of these and put together a better standard for across the board. So I think things to keep in mind, and this sort of goes to the reparations question as well, is that the reparations have also been flawed. I mean, I think the positive obligations in the treaty offer, yes, reparations is part of it, but it also offers things that should be considered in addition to reparations. That it sets a standard that against which to judge the existing models. And yes, there are some good things to draw from them, but there is no adequate model. At the Marshall Islands, there is a tribunal that gave some assistance, but it's way out of money. It has been out of money for years. There are some health screenings that are available and some provision for, like, they used to send people to the States to get thyroid treatment for cancer, but that's sort of been stopped, and there's health screening, but it's very inadequate. So yes, there's some efforts, but again, woefully inadequate. So the Marshall Islands I know best because I did some research there a couple of years ago. But what we've been trying to outline, there's a report we did called Confronting Conflict Pollution that lays out steps on the victim assistance side. You should be providing healthcare, you should be providing, also things beyond that, like helping with cultural practice, dealing with displacement, et cetera, et cetera. On the environmental side, I think it's even more complicated. Have to deal with all these different layers of addressing remediation. So I guess I don't have one good example model to give you. So, but definitely it goes to the earlier point I mentioned about a global survey, not just of the needs assessment, but of the models out there.
Thank you, Bonnie. And the next question was from Dimity. What do you think Australia should be doing for our testing history in regards to environmental remediation and survivors? Big question there.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's the same vague answer, Dimity. I mean, I think I'd say sort of first of all, consultation with the local communities, I think, is crucial. Find out what the needs are, find out what they're looking for. But in terms of general principles, on the environmental side, I think it's important to assess the problem. I mean, the steps we've outlined is to assess the problem. We refer to as optimization, figure out what the costs and benefits of the social, economic, environmental, cultural costs and benefits, erring towards precautionary measures, erring towards doing something about it. Like, you presumably should do something about it, but weighing against what the local communities want. Contain, remove, treat the problem. And also, that's really important to have a long-term solution. This isn't just immediate solution that you should be, radiation's there for years, decades, centuries. You should have a long-term solution for this. For waste management and so forth. Throughout the process, it should be transparent, so the communities can protect themselves. And throughout the process, sharing information with others, so that whether it's Australia hopefully can help fund their own treatment, but also if in communities where that's less possible, that they can get outside help from other, hopefully, states parties at some point. Those are some of the steps we've outlined for environmental remediation. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some of the things we have in mind. And some of that will be in the fact sheet, and then we're doing a larger report laying out all those steps, hopefully in the coming months.
Thanks for that, Bonnie. And I think that would go to answering the question about facilitating the process of engagement between affected states and individuals on one hand, and the nuclear powers and agencies on the other. also just want to sort of add to that question and ask about the meeting of states parties, and do you expect that this will be a topic of conversation there, and will there need to be anything need to be settled or decided about these provisions at that meeting?
I think it's crucial. My sense is it's going to be a big topic of conversation at the first meeting of states parties. Austria, who's president of the conference, has seems to agree that it's an important topic, and it's certainly something we've advocated for, and ICANN's advocating for. We're advocating for 3 things to come out of it. One is what they call a declaration, where it's like a political declaration, where emphasizing the importance of these articles, setting it as a priority. Also, an action plan is usually adopted at these meetings, where they set out specific steps that states parties should take in the coming couple of years, such as what I mentioned about, you should adopt an action plan, you should start assessing the problem, those kind of very practical steps. And also, we're encouraging them to adopt either formal committees or informal working groups that delve between meetings of states parties. There's only so much you can do in the short period of time, but those are to continue the conversation. It's very thorny issues, and they need to do works between meetings to really delve into the complicated issues. There is I should note that Kiribati and Kazakhstan have started a working group. We're trying to get other states to join, to come up with a working plan, a working paper, to make some proposals for what that action plan should include. So we encourage ICANN campaigners to push their states to join that working group, to really prepare for the 1 MSP. There's only so much you can do at the meeting itself. The work needs to be done in advance. So happy to talk to campaigners afterwards, but that would be an important campaigning activity in the coming months. Get your states to join that working group and to really do work beforehand on this issue. I think it's really important. I think Austria is supportive of it, but we need to get the work done in the next couple months.
Yes, great. It'd be amazing to get Australia to engage with that, and also to obviously sign and ratify. I don't think they'll be putting their hand up just yet, but we'll push them. I'll just give you two final little questions. Actually, there were 3 that I will handball to you, please. So one question was basically about accountability for nuclear test. If a nuclear test was to take place today, what kind of accountability is there? Then there was a question around victim assistance and intergenerational trauma, and whether there are any measures in mind for addressing that. And there was a question also about the Runit Dome, which houses nuclear testing waste in the Marshall Islands. So if I can give those 3 to you, and then after that, we will go to the next part of the agenda and break into our breakout groups.
Okay. Runit Dome, there's been a lot of press about it. I'm not sure if any action is being taken, but it's definitely an issue and feel free if others, Tim or Vanessa, you have more information on that. So definitely an issue in the news. I hope some action will be taken, but I haven't heard of any steps that have been taken to address it. I mean, maybe there's been some studies going on, but I haven't heard of any efforts, unfortunately, that have been taken. Measures in mind for intergenerational trauma. Again, I think that's something that should be covered under victim assistance. I mean, it calls for psychological help, and it is sort of a part of the long-term. Victim assistance is a long-term effort, but I don't know. I mean, that's sort of more something the medical professional should step in and offer suggestions for that. So I don't know specifically what would be the answer, but something that would definitely be included in victim assistance. And the last question was on accountability for testing, I think it was. I mean, if a state joined the treaty, obviously it would be prohibited to do ongoing testing. I mean, it would be prohibited under the partial test ban, presumably. The comprehensive test ban treaty hasn't taken effect. The international law is always tricky in the sense there isn't necessarily a clear place to bring states to court. I mean, there is the International Court of Justice, but a lot of it is political pressure and so forth. So I think there would certainly be outcry, but it's not always a clear place to bring cases to bring judicial decisions. But I mean, there would certainly be public outcry and outrage. So in terms of a guilty party, it's hard to say that there necessarily be a trial or something like that. But it'd certainly be a clear violation of international law. Again, sort of a wishy-washy answer.